Locked away, the psychological breakdown behind 23 hours of solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is often described as a prison inside a prison. But hidden behind steel doors and concrete silence is a psychological world few ever escape unchanged. What happens to the human mind when it is stripped of sound, touch, time, and contact? Not for minutes, but for months or years. Tonight, we step into that invisible battlefield. Not to shock you, not to dramatize anything, but to reveal what isolation really does to the brain based on real science, real inmates, and real verified research. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. For decades, solitary confinement has been used across U.S. prisons as a disciplinary tool, a protective measure, and sometimes simply because there weren't enough staff. But modern psychological research from the American Psychological Association, the National Institute of Justice, NIJ, Dr. Craig Haney's decades-long studies on prison mental health, and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, reports paints a darker, more complex picture. Isolation doesn't just control behavior. It reshapes the mind. This documentary uncovers the mental, emotional, and cognitive effects of extreme isolation through verified science and real inmate accounts that show the silent damage happening behind closed doors. The door closes. The first thing inmates describe is not the silence, but the disconnection. No handshakes, no eye contact, no sound of another person breathing in the same space. According to Dr. Haney's long-term psychological research on SHU, security housing unit environments, the human mind begins reacting within hours. The brain is wired for interaction, and when deprived, it starts searching for stimulation anywhere it can find it, even inside its own fears. One former inmate, interviewed in a CDCR mental health review, described his first week this way. It's like the world shrinks to the size of your thoughts, and your thoughts aren't always your friends. He was not violent. He was not dangerous. He had been placed in isolation for protective separation after being threatened in general population. Yet the effects were the same. Racing thoughts, disrupted sleep, distorted sense of time, emotional numbness. A separate NIJ report documents similar patterns in dozens of inmates. Talking to themselves to stay grounded. Pacing for hours. Counting cracks in the wall to avoid mental drift. Losing track of whether it's day or night. These reactions are not signs of weakness. They're signs of a brain under stress. The APA has repeatedly warned that prolonged isolation triggers symptoms similar to sensory deprivation experiments from the 20th century. Experiments that scientists had to stop early because participants began hallucinating in less than 48 hours. One inmate interviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab recalled trying desperately to hold on to reality. I started repeating my name, my birthday, anything. You feel like you're slipping away, and you know nobody can hear you. That's the worst part, the slipping. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery from years of verified research is this. Even inmates who enter solitary confinement mentally stable often emerge with long-lasting psychological changes, heightened anxiety, paranoid thoughts, emotional volatility, and difficulty reconnecting with people. The door is closed. The silence begins. And the mind starts fighting a quiet war with itself. When reality starts to bend, the second stage of solitary confinement doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in slowly, the way darkness fills a room when the sun sets. Psychologists call it cognitive drift. Inmates call it losing the thread. According to the American Psychological Association and Dr. Haney's SHU research, the lack of external stimulation forces the brain to turn inward. Thoughts loop, emotions intensify, and the mind begins filling the silence with whatever it can create. One inmate, interviewed in an NIJ-supported field study, said, "It's not the voices you hear, it's the ones your mind invents just to keep you company." He wasn't describing hallucinations, not yet. He was describing the way isolation magnifies ordinary worries until they feel like threats. Without routine conversations, subtle corrections, social cues, or even facial expressions, the brain begins misfiring. Psychological studies published by Yale Law School's Lyman Center show that inmates in long-term isolation experience difficulty organizing thoughts, memory lapses, intrusive self-criticism, exaggerated startle responses, loss of future orientation. To put it simply, isolation makes it harder to think, harder to plan, and harder to stay emotionally regulated. Yet the most haunting part isn't the fear, it's the emptiness. A former inmate in a CDCR mental health review explained it like this: "You're not scared. You're numb. And when you finally feel something, it hits you like a truck." Emotional flattening, a known effect documented in solitary confinement studies, becomes a survival mechanism. But survival has a cost. The less you feel, the less connected you become to anything, including yourself. As the hours turn into weeks, many inmates begin to experience what psychologists refer to as perceptual distortions. These are not hallucinations, but the world begins to lose its sharpness. Shadows seem deeper. Footsteps sound closer or farther away than they actually are. Time feels elastic, stretching and snapping without warning. A Chicago Crime Lab interview describes one man spending nearly 3 hours staring at the same spot on the wall, convinced it was shifting slightly each minute. When officers asked if he was all right, he insisted the wall had breathed. His experience is not unique. Decades of correctional mental health evaluations show that the brain, deprived of stimulation, begins creating its own sensory input. This is the psychological threshold, not full psychosis, not hallucination, but the edge, the moment where the mind begins rewriting reality just to endure the silence. And for many, Chapter 2 is only the beginning. The mind builds its own companions. By the time someone reaches the third psychological stage of solitary confinement, the brain has exhausted most of its natural defenses. Silence has become normal. Time has become shapeless. Thoughts no longer move in straight lines. They bend, loop, and return with new edges. Researchers from the American Psychological Association note that prolonged sensory deprivation forces the brain to manufacture stimulation, even when none exists. Not because the person is weak, but because the human mind is engineered for connection. Inmates describe this stage with unsettling clarity. You start talking to the cell, and the cell talks back in its own way. This doesn't mean hearing voices. It means every sound takes on meaning. A faucet drip, a distant door slam, the hum of lights. Each becomes a companion, a marker of existence in a world that otherwise feels empty. A man interviewed by the National Institute of Justice recalled naming the sounds in his cell to stay grounded. The tap on the plumbing became Frank. The squeak of his bunk frame became Lewis. It wasn't delusion, it was survival. The brain was trying to fill the void. Verified research from Dr. Craig Haney describes this phenomenon as anthropomorphizing the environment, assigning personality to the inanimate as a coping strategy. It's common in isolation settings, from SHU units in California to protective custody in Illinois. One inmate in a CDCR psychological review explained the shift this way. You try to keep your mind sharp. You count. You recall memories. You repeat old conversations. But eventually, the memories start answering you back. His statement reflects a well-documented psychological effect. Internal dialogue becomes externalized, not as hallucinations, but as vivid imagined conversations with people from one's past. This stage often brings blurred emotional boundaries, heightened sensitivity to minor sounds. Intense mental replay of past mistakes. Uncontrollable daydreaming. Fragmenting attention. According to the Lyman Center's national reports, inmates in prolonged isolation commonly experience what psychologists call identity diffusion. This is when a person begins to lose the sense of who they are outside the cell. One former prisoner told researchers, "You stop being a person. You become a mind floating in a box." Yet the most alarming part of Chapter 3 isn't the imagined conversations or the distortions. It's the slow erosion of emotional reality. Without interaction, the emotional system dulls. Without sunlight, energy collapses. Without feedback, the self-image warps. This is not madness. It is the predictable outcome of extreme environmental deprivation, documented by decades of APA, NJ, and prison mental health data. The brain is adapting to survive a world it was never designed to endure. And for many, the journey is about to descend even deeper. When a mind turns against itself, by the time isolation stretches into weeks or months, a new psychological battle begins. It is no longer about loneliness. It is about self-preservation versus self-erosion. Verified studies from the American Psychological Association and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation show that the next stage is marked by something researchers call hyperreactivity. The brain becomes extremely sensitive to even the smallest disturbance. A distant shout, a guard's footsteps, the metallic clang of a meal slot. Any sound becomes amplified, sharper than it should be, as if the nervous system is permanently set to alert. A man interviewed by the National Institute of Justice described it perfectly. When you're alone that long, your head becomes a microphone. Every tiny sound feels like it's inside your skull. This heightened sensitivity isn't fear, it's overstimulation after extreme deprivation. The brain, desperate for input, latches onto anything it can find. And when stimulation finally arrives, it overwhelms. Psychologists have documented inmates flinching at their own breathing, startled by their own heartbeat, or panicking when a guard unexpectedly opens the food flap. This reaction is not dramatic. It is physiological. Without regular interaction, the body's stress systems begin firing unpredictably. But the most dangerous shift isn't physical. It's internal conflict. Inmate interviews collected in CDCR's mental health evaluations describe a stage where the mind begins attacking itself. Constant self-blame, spiraling guilt, imagining worst-case scenarios, obsessing over past decisions, intense negative self-talk. It is the psychological equivalent of being trapped in a room with your harshest critic, except that critic is your own reflection. One former inmate from Chicago Crime Lab interview explained, "The silence makes your thoughts louder. Eventually, your thoughts feel like your enemy." This stage often includes emotional distortion, documented by Dr. Craig Haney, where everyday feelings become exaggerated. A small worry becomes dread. A minor memory becomes shame. A brief irritation becomes rage. Not because the person is unstable, but because the mind no longer has real-world feedback to regulate emotions. According to APA-backed research, the lack of human interaction destabilizes emotional processing. Humans learn emotional balance through subtle cues, facial expressions, tone of voice, reassurance, disagreement. In isolation, none of these exist. So the brain begins processing emotions alone, in a vacuum, with no external anchor. The result is predictable. A person can feel overwhelmed by thoughts that would normally be manageable in social environments. An inmate in protective custody, not punishment, described it like this: "I wasn't angry before solitary, but alone that long, the anger grows legs." Still, it's important to note, these reactions are not signs of danger to others. They're signs of internal pressure with nowhere to go. And this is only the psychological storm building inside the unit. For many inmates, the next stage brings a different kind of collapse, where the mind stops fighting altogether. The collapse of routine. At this stage of isolation, something subtle but devastating happens. The breakdown of structure. Human beings rely on routine to stay mentally anchored. Waking up at a certain time, interacting with people, responding to tasks, following schedules. But solitary confinement strips all of that away. Verified research from the National Institute of Justice and the APA shows that when routine disappears, the brain begins losing its sense of sequence. Days blur. Motivation fades. Behavior becomes reactive rather than intentional. A former inmate in a CDCR mental health interview said, "You stop planning. You stop expecting. You just exist. And the longer you just exist, the harder it becomes to remember who you were." This is not exaggeration. It's a documented psychological effect known as temporal disorientation, where the ability to track time weakens and the brain stops forming clear memories. Without routine, inmates often fall into cycles that repeat without purpose, sleeping at random hours, pacing without noticing distance, staring at a wall for long stretches, forgetting whether they've eaten, losing interest in personal hygiene, not because they're neglectful, but because the internal clock begins slipping. A Chicago crime lab interview described a man who stopped brushing his teeth for days simply because he couldn't remember whether he had done it already. "I thought I brushed them. Maybe I didn't. Maybe it was yesterday. Maybe it was earlier today. I couldn't tell." This isn't laziness. It's neurological drift caused by extreme monotony. Psychologists call it executive function erosion, and Dr. Craig Haney's research shows it is one of the most common mental changes observed in long-term solitary confinement. The mind becomes slower at initiating tasks, following steps, solving problems, switching between thoughts. The simplest actions start to feel heavy, but the emotional impact of this decline is even heavier. Many inmates report feeling detached from themselves. They speak about themselves in the past tense. "I used to," or "I was the kind of guy who," as if describing someone who no longer exists. One NIJ interviewee said, "You feel like a stranger wearing your own memories." And yet, even this stage has a deeper layer, one that psychologists consider the tipping point. When the mind becomes comfortable with isolation. Not safe, not stable, but comfortable in the sense that the outside world begins to feel overwhelming or distant. This shift is dangerous because it reverses the natural human instinct for connection. The cell becomes familiar, silence becomes normal, and anything outside begins to feel threatening. This is where many inmates describe feeling unprepared, even terrified, of returning to regular human contact. According to APA-supported findings, long-term solitary confinement can make some individuals avoid interaction even when it becomes available. In short, isolation becomes its own universe, and escaping it, even mentally, becomes harder with each passing day. But the true breaking point lies ahead, when the walls of the cell are no longer the only thing closing in. The emotional shutdown. If earlier stages of solitary confinement are defined by overstimulation, intrusive thoughts, and internal conflict, this stage is defined by something far quieter and far more dangerous. Emotional shutdown. According to verified findings from the American Psychological Association and long-term solitary research conducted by Dr. Craig Haney, a person in prolonged isolation eventually stops reacting emotionally altogether. Not because they overcome the suffering, but because their system simply can't respond anymore. It's the mind's equivalent of flipping a breaker. One inmate interviewed in an NIJ-supported study described it in a single chilling sentence. "I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was nothing. This is not apathy. This is emotional depletion, a psychological condition where the brain, overwhelmed for too long, conserves energy by shutting down emotional processing." Symptoms documented in CDCR and APA reports include lack of expression, inability to cry, emotional numbness, reduced empathy, disconnection from one's own thoughts, a sense of watching life instead of living it. This is the mind's survival instinct, but it comes at a cost. A former inmate interviewed by the Chicago Crime Lab explained how emotional shutdown sneaks in. "At first, I was fighting to stay sharp. Then I was fighting to stay calm. Then one day, I stopped fighting at all. Because without stimulation, without contact, without normal human feedback, the emotional system loses its purpose. This stage is where many inmates say they felt truly unsafe, not because of others, but because of themselves. Not violent, not unstable, just empty. And in that emptiness, identity begins to dissolve further. Researchers refer to this effect as flattened effect, a clinical term observed in sensory deprivation experiments, extreme isolation cases, long-term segregation units, individuals cut off from social cues for extended periods. But in solitary confinement, the impact is magnified because the environment is designed to eliminate stimulation, not restore it. One CDCR psychological review describes a man who spent 18 months in segregation. When asked how he felt during that time, he said, "Feeling? You forget what that word means." This stage also makes reintegration harder. The longer emotional shutdown continues, the more foreign human contact feels. When officers speak, it feels abrupt. When another inmate shouts, it feels overwhelming. When someone asks a question, it feels intrusive. This is why APA-backed research shows that individuals who experience long-term isolation often struggle with social reintegration. Not because they don't want connection, but because their emotional systems have gone offline. And when emotional shutdown deepens, many cross into the next psychological threshold. Displacement from reality itself. Not hallucination, not psychosis, but a subtle drift, a sense that the world outside the cell is fading into something abstract and unreachable. This is the beginning of the most complex and fragile stage of solitary confinement psychology. Drifting out of reality. By now, the psychological journey through solitary confinement has moved far beyond loneliness or boredom. It has crossed into a place where the mind begins decoupling from reality. This stage isn't about dramatic breakdowns or hallucinations. Verified research from the APA, NIJ, and the Lyman Center shows that many inmates instead experience something far more subtle and far more damaging. A gradual erosion of the boundary between internal thoughts and the outside world. A former inmate in a CDCR psychological evaluation described it this way. "You know the world is out there, but it stops feeling real. The only thing that feels real is the room." This is called depersonalization and derealization, where the self and the environment feel distorted, distant, or dreamlike. In this stage, inmates often report watching themselves from a distance, feeling detached from their own actions, sensing that time isn't moving correctly, believing the outside world has shrunk or disappeared, forgetting the sound of normal conversation, imagining social interactions instead of remembering real ones. One NIJ interviewee said, "People became memories. Memories became stories. Stories became fog. And once this fog settles in, it becomes almost impossible for the brain to reverse it without human interaction." Psychologists emphasize this point repeatedly. The human mind is not built to operate in isolation. Social cues, facial expressions, tone, conflict, reassurance. These are the invisible forces that shape our emotional balance. Without them, the brain begins constructing its own substitutes. For some, that means clinging to memories. For others, it means inventing structure where none exists. And for the most affected, it means drifting into a psychological no man's land, present, but not fully connected to themselves. A man from Chicago Crime Lab study explained the final stage with chilling honesty. Solitary doesn't break you loud. It breaks you quietly. By the time you notice, pieces of you are already gone. This is the silent crisis hidden inside isolation units, one that decades of verified research continue to highlight, yet remains largely unseen by the public. The silence we can no longer ignore. Solitary confinement is not a mystery anymore. It is not speculation. It is not myth. The verified research is clear. Isolation changes the human mind in ways that few environments on Earth can replicate. From the APA to the NIJ. From Dr. Craig Haney's decades of studies to the CDCR's own mental health evaluations. From the Chicago Crime Lab's interviews to national investigations into segregation units. The conclusion is the same. The real danger of solitary confinement isn't what happens inside the cell. It's what happens inside the mind. And whether someone is guilty or innocent, violent or nonviolent, sentenced or awaiting trial, no human brain is built to withstand 23 hours of silence, day after day, without consequences. Not because they are weak, but because they are human. If documentaries like this matter to you, if you want more real, research-backed investigations into prisons, psychology, and the hidden systems most people never see, then hit subscribe, because every new voice helps expose what was designed to stay hidden. And the next story we uncover might be even darker.